Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance Podcast. I'm Mario Nájera, and for today's guest, we have Dr. Janet Lewis, co-founder of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Rochester. Dr. Lewis' work focuses on the psychological impact of climate change and how therapy can address the challenges people face in this context. Her article, Climate Dialectics in Psychotherapy, Holding Open the Space Between the Abyss and Advance, explores how therapists can support individuals navigate these complex emotions. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for being here today. And before we dive into our main discussion, let's start with a lighter question to help our audience get to know you better. What's your favorite movie of all time and why?
Well, actually, it's a very quirky movie. It's called Quest for Fire. It came out in the 1980s, and it's about a very early prehistoric group of people that are discovering how to make fire for themselves. And parts of the movie are quite funny. A few guys from the group whose fire's been extinguished go out to try to find fire, and they have adventures, getting exposed to new groups and all sorts of new experiences. But part of the movie is really moving. When the main character first sees another human being able to make fire, he cries. And later, when he returns to his own group and is showing the others how to do it, by this point in the movie, you've come to understand many of the words of their very small vocabulary. And you can tell that before he shows them, he's making a little speech, and he's referring to himself as fire maker. It's a very moving moment. And I guess that movie, my favorite movie, does relate to climate change. I hadn't put this together before until you asked the question. I guess it relates to climate change, both because it's about the beginning of our combustion activities, but also I think historically we're in a similarly pivotal time, similar to humans harnessing fire. And I really hope, of course, that new capacities are coming online, will come online in us as a result of necessity now. And also, just like the movie, there are aspects of the situation we're in that may be having to do with relational capacities and identity issues, as well as what we do behaviorally. So you may not have expected such a heavy response, but here we are.
Here we are indeed. That's such an interesting choice, Dr. Lewis. I haven't seen Quest for Fire before, but the way you describe it makes me want to check it out. It sounds like it has such a unique way of capturing the important moment in history, and I can see how it ties into what we're facing now with climate change. On that note, I would love to hear more about your journey with the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and what led you to focus on this intersection of climate and mental health.
Well, there have always been some environmentally aware and environmentally active psychiatrists, thank goodness. But the Climate Psychiatry Alliance started as a very small group, a handful of us. Each of us had been looking for other psychiatrists who were interested in climate change, and we were able to find each other. And when the group started, it was mostly older people. Most of us were older women, actually. But fortunately, there was one younger person in the group, Alex Trope, and he was able to put together our first rudimentary website, so journalists and others could find us. And now we have 1,000 members. My own interests developed pretty rapidly. I'm one of the people who sort of had a climate awakening. I was at a conference, and my suite mate there was pretty agitated about climate change. And she looked me in the eye and she said, "The bottom line, Janet, is that we may be able to adjust to 2 degrees, but right now we're on track for over 5 degrees, and that would create a world we would not recognize." And that information just penetrated for me in the moment, even though I'd heard it before. And so I straight away thought about what I'm good at, how I could contribute, and went looking for like-minded colleagues. I think I may have been kind of primed for an awakening because I've been through some disasters. I've been in a hurricane. I've had my house burned down. I've been in flooding. So that probably did prime me for some awareness. But I was also kind of set on a path of really wrestling with the question of what helps people be contained enough for the information to penetrate. And now also I wonder about what helps people to be contained enough to be able to think about our multiple potential futures too, because the future isn't just one thing, but we're in relationship right now with multiple possible futures. That particular conference where that information penetrated for me was an extremely supportive environment. And so now I've been thinking about what helps us to be with such difficult information and use it and help others to use it.
Well, thank you for that response. It's really inspiring, and it's incredible how personal experience can drive us to take action. Talking about being in a hurricane, having your house burn down, and experiencing flooding shows how powerful and transformative such events can be. As you know, I live here in Guatemala, and while we do not have hurricanes, we have experienced volcano eruptions that has paralyzed the city and honestly caused a lot of damage to nearby villages. So, yeah, so I can kind of relate with that. But at the same time, we also had flooding, very bad floodings here. So just story just resonated with me. Yeah.
So then you know the reality of how bad things can happen. And it's important to know that.
Moving from that idea, your work on the climate dialectics takes a deeper look at how we navigate the psychological challenges of climate change. Please tell us more about climate dialectics.
Sure. Now, dialectics, which I'll define here in a moment, arise with any thinking about climate change and about its implications, because climate change is so complex and so threatening that the mind isn't able to hold it all. Climate change has been called a hyperobject. This was a term coined by Morton. It's something that has coherence and vitality, but it is so distributed through space and time and with ourselves inside of it that there's a sense in which it's impossible to completely wrap your mind around it. So the mind working with climate change creates dialectics. And the creation of the dialectics is kind of akin to splitting, which is why when it comes to climate change, we're all like the blind men with the elephant. You'll see arguments about climate change where, say, someone is arguing about the importance of individual responsibility, and someone else is arguing about the importance of collective action. And of course, both are true, right? Both are important.
Yeah.
Both are true. But it's hard to hold these things in the mind at the same time. People who have studied philosophy will recognize this term dialectics from Hegel. And a dialectic is any pair of seemingly opposed concepts that are actually both important. Because they seem opposed, it's tempting to side with one or the other of them, but it's important not to do that. Both poles of the dialectic are important. And when each pole is explored and the space between them is explored, it's generative. It allows for creative solutions. Hegel, you may remember, called this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where there was this polarization, thesis, antithesis, but then this space between them worked with create synthesis. He wasn't talking about a definitive synthesis. It's not like there's one right answer as you wrestle with these things. But what he was talking about in his writings was an assumption of wholeness, that when we're dealing with these polarities, it's important for us to assume that there's some wholeness that is encompassing all of it. So for the therapist, understanding that we're in a situation that naturally leads to the formation of these dialectics in the mind is really useful. And understanding that this can also be quite hopeful, because as the dialectics are grappled with, new solutions come about. So we're not just understanding how these problematic defensive things are going on in the mind, but we're also understanding how to use it in ways that can help lead the patient, lead ourselves forward. That's the value of understanding climate dialectics. And one way to recognize them is when something feels too simple or too easy. Like when someone is just expressing something very hopeful, or when someone is just laughing about how horrible the state of the world is. That's too easy. And so when we hear that, it's important for us to be keeping in mind, there's another pole here. And to, as we talk about it, be thinking about what the space between those poles might be. And another important thing to do in understanding the existence of dialectics is for us to train ourselves to say and instead of but. If you really pay attention to how you talk, you'll find that most of the time when we say but, we're inadvertently strengthening some polarity, and we don't really mean to be doing that. It's more useful. Sometimes we do mean but it's more useful to be saying and at the same time. When you find yourself feeling in opposition to what someone says, if you can find any usefulness in what they're saying, then try to say and at the same time instead of but.
Yeah.
And so a lot of work going on now really involves the necessity of being able to hold in mind more than one thing at the same time. We have to do this in relation to the future and considering our multiple potential futures. And this is something we're actually really good at as mental health professionals. We do this all the time, helping people with both and kinds of thinking. And that's a capacity that's something that requires particular emphasis and development right now as we deal with climate change.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So let me see if I understand this correctly. Are you saying we can think of this concept as a spectrum with two polar opposite ideas, but with many points along the way that might also hold truth? And perhaps the most accurate perspective lies somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think of it more as a triangle. Because it's not as though with a lot of these dialectics, there's some compromise. It's more that there are two things that are true. And so what does that mean? There's the creation of something different.
I see. I think I get it now. In your article, you also discuss the importance of climate-aware therapy. Can you please tell us more about it?
Climate-aware therapy is what it sounds like. It's therapy that's done with an awareness on the part of the therapist of climate change, and an awareness of the myriad ways that people are experiencing climate change. There's a whole range of feelings and experiences that people can get in relation to climate change, both from direct effects of climate change, like if you're in a disaster or multiple disasters or heat waves, and also especially the indirect emotional effects from grappling with difficult knowledge about climate change. Knowledge about climate change has been called toxic knowledge because it can be such a challenge to wrestle with it. And then there are also interpersonal effects of climate change, as oftentimes we're figuring out how to do things and other people are figuring out how to do things, and different people are having their different perspectives and also are in different places in the extent of their understanding of what's happening. And that can lead to interpersonal issues. And then there are also all the ways that people defensively deal or don't deal with climate change. All the psychological defenses that are brought to bear. The most important of which I think is disavowal. We're all capable of knowing and not knowing something at the same time. And we're all in varying degrees of disavowal. So disavowal is where we know it, but we sort of push it down as though we don't know it. And so we're able to behave as though we don't know it. And we, all of us, are capable of this. And with climate change, we're all going in and out of varying degrees of disavowal all the time. It's important to to understand this, not only to help our patients and ourselves with our awareness, but also to promote an attitude where we know there are no climate perfect people. There are no people who have completely come to terms with this and adjusted their lives accordingly. And understanding how we're all dealing with disavowal can promote this necessary attitude of accepting people where they are, at the same time that we don't collude with climate misinformation or denial. So the climate aware therapist has these understandings and attitudes. And this is essential in contemporary psychotherapy because, as I was saying about that movie, we're at a particular time, all of us, including our patients. Everyone has to grapple with the fact, whether they're actively doing it or not, still, this is what's called for. The fact that new things are required of us now. We have to be able to think about climate change, about the multiple potential futures, as I mentioned, and we have to innovate and develop means of resilience in the face of what in our lifetimes will be increasingly difficult climate, extreme weather, and needs for a lot of people to move. And we need to grapple with this in fairly short order. So the climate aware therapist, while accepting where the patient is and respecting the patient's goals, also has this in the back of their minds and also knows that some degree of this is also in the back of the patient's mind. Everyone has been exposed to the weather being different and has been exposed to this information. And we know from surveys of Americans that most Americans are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. So this is in the back of the patient's mind, whether they're directly talking about it or not. And not only is it in the back of their mind, but it's something that involves tremendous uncertainty and threat. So it's a big thing in the back of their patient's mind. So this is why all therapists do need awareness of this.
Yeah. We're heading on a path where climate events are getting more frequent and climate change is getting really out of hand. So clinicians should know or be prepared to kind of have these discussions with patients. And for the end of education, I would like to go deeper into the main climate dialectics. Can you tell us more about that?
The 5 main climate dialectics we identified are, and I want to make sure it's clear, this dialectics paper was written not only by me, I was the first author, but also Beth Haas and Alex Trope. The 5 main dialectics that we identified are climate reality and social reality, individual agency and collective agency, nature is comfort and nature is threat, hope and hopelessness, and uncertainty and certainty. We talk about these in detail in the paper, along with clinical vignettes associated with them, which may be of interest to clinicians. Mm-hmm. There are dialectics also that you will see arising all the time in talking about climate material. So it's not only these 5, but we think of these as the central ones. They're all challenging and they often have implications for each other. But I think the central one is hopelessness dialectic. I think it's particularly challenging because it often appears in sneaky ways. For instance, someone can just sound a bit cynical, and you may not recognize that this crucial dialectic needs to be wrestled with. They sound cynical because there's the hopelessness dialectic, or someone may just joke about the state of the world, and it may be tempting to laugh along with it, but it's important not to, because there's a real crucial thing to be wrestled with there that is dialectical. And when it comes to hope and hopelessness, what kind of hope we're using and how we use it are very important. We may think that hope is always a good thing, but it's not that simple. Hope can get used defensively, just as hopelessness can get used defensively. People can side with hope as a way of avoiding difficult realities, avoiding the responsibility to reflect on them and use their agency and to have to work with other people. So hope can be a smokescreen, a distraction, like a means of avoiding the difficult stuff. And hopelessness also can get used defensively. If everything's hopeless, then I don't have to grapple again with difficult realities. I don't have to get involved. I don't have to challenge myself to work with others and do things outside my comfort zone. You'll see some people embracing the idea of complete collapse or human extinction in this way. Now, not everyone who's entertaining reflection on possibilities of collapse is doing this. But some people are. Some people are doing it defensively. And what's important is that when both hope and hopeless feelings and thoughts are taken seriously, when they're both held side by side and grappled with, rather than allowing one pole of the dialectic to collapse into the other side, then the space between them emerges that allows for new kinds of hope to emerge that are healthier. And one of these healthier kinds of hope that keeps getting rediscovered has been called reasonable hope. The first place I see this described in the mental health literature is by Weingarten in 2010. She calls it reasonable hope. It's been called other things also. And with this, hope is understood as a verb. It's what we're doing. Hope is a verb, not a feeling. And we're doing hope whenever we're creating goals and pathways to the goals and readjusting the goals and the pathways as circumstances warrant. Hope is something we do, as I said. Another potentially healthy kind of hope emerging in this dialectical struggle is what's been called radical hope, that's talked about in a book by Lear. Radical hope is when we step forward, even when we can't know exactly how we're going to do it. But we are feeling called to step forward, and so we step forward. And we in the mental health professions require some engagement in radical hope now. We can't know for sure what the mental health landscape is going to look like in 10 years with more disasters and forced migrations and all the social stress accompanying that will lead to greater individual stress and symptoms and various kinds of regressions. But with radical hope, we can take steps forward. And then when we do that, more of what we're dealing with and how to approach it will become clearer. Oftentimes you can't see things until you are moving into them with commitment to engage with them. There's a philosophical concept called the adjacent possible that's about this, that we only become clear about what's possible as we explore it. So that's the hope-hopelessness dialectic. And as I said, it's quite connected to the other dialectics because grappling with any of the other dialectics will evoke some hopelessness along the way. And as we do it, it's important that we don't collude with cynicism and other inappropriate kinds of hopelessness, and that we don't collude with any kind of Pollyanna hope as these issues are grappled with.
Wow. The hope and hopelessness dialectics is definitely a tough one. You just made me think about this concept I had of heroism versus a doom mentality. Being the doom mentality when you collapse and you cannot go through with your plans and what you wanted to accomplish. And the heroism view being something as we are going to fix everything, everything's going to be okay, and kind of like not thinking about what's real and what can be accomplished in the real world.
Well, the doom, I think the doom, as you're talking about it, is very much like using hopelessness defensively. Heroism is Pollyanna hope, but heroism can be a kind of throwing oneself into kinds of hope that don't fully take into consideration the aspects that are important of hopelessness and the things that are then required as a result of that. You know, it's easy for activists to get burned out, for example.
I see.
When they're not accepting the limitations that are real on them as individuals. The heroism does have its sort of shadow side that way.
Yeah, finding a healthy balance sounds essential to navigate through this. So moving on, I'm curious about how this approach helps specifically with climate anxiety compared to traditional anxiety disorders. And How does working with this climate dialectics therapy help manage climate anxiety differently compared to traditional anxiety disorders?
This is a really good question. If climate anxiety is at a point where it's really interfering with functioning, it's kind of an adjustment disorder. And with an adjustment disorder, we respect what the stressor actually is and help the patient come to terms with the real life stressor at the same time that we're helping them manage the anxiety or the other difficult emotional reactions. So this is different than other anxiety disorders where the emphasis would be just on how to reduce the anxiety. That's not the goal here. We need to help people with functioning, yes, but we need to help them manage the anxiety well enough, but the goal isn't to get rid of the anxiety. The goal is to help the patient find meaningful ways of thinking and behaving and being in relationships that will then make the anxiety more bearable. And as they act on what they find meaningful and repeatedly explore how to find meaning and exercise reasonable and radical hope, then that all helps to make things bearable. One has to be with the anxiety, though, in order to learn from it, to learn what one is feeling most anxious about, or hopeless, or fearful, or angry, or guilty, or shameful, or disgusted. All of these, kinds of reactions that arise, or what's breaking one's heart. One has to be with the anxiety enough to be able to learn that. And the treatment is also different than anxiety disorders in that with climate change, we and the patients are in the same social crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We're all working to hold in mind and respond to difficult realities and maintain a sense of agency and possibility in doing that. So one thing about climate anxiety is that even though the therapist is there to help the patient, and there are things about the patient's experience that will be different than the therapist, still, this isn't just a patient's problem. This is a shared social problem.
I appreciate how you framed it as a shared problem. So the objective is to first acknowledge and empathize with our feelings, reduce anxiety, and then act in meaningful ways that keeps us going. So what are the key roles therapists play in this?
Well, one is what's called containment, which is about how we bear what's difficult to bear, how the unbearable is made bearable. There's containment we give in the way we relate to the patient, the way we take seriously and take in their experience and, in a sense, metabolize it and give new things back to them that are bearable. And we help the patient also, though, access other forms of containment too. Other things can help make the unbearable bearable in their relationships, in other forms of spirituality they may be using, religious practices, imagery, narratives. All of these things can be meaningful for them, and actions also can be meaningful. So one of the roles we play has to do with both providing containment and helping the patient access other forms of containment. Now, the way the anxiety gets transformed is first in taking it seriously, the therapist validating it. And this is important even if the therapist recognizes that the distress is also coming from something else. I mean, say there's a patient feeling helpless about climate change, and we know and we can hear in the way they're talking about things that their sense of helplessness is also related to a history of childhood abuse. This is another both and situation where we can hold and explore and validate multiple causes of distress without dismissing any of them. Or even with someone who's psychotic. I mean, say part of their symptoms are related to climate change. Well, we can talk about the treatment of psychosis without dismissing the disturbing reality of climate change. So the first step in transforming the anxiety is validating it. And then the anxiety can, in part, it doesn't all go away, but it can, in part, be transformed into sources of meaning. And that can result from the grappling with the dialectics. As the poles are explored, people can get down to what's most truthful and most important for them. So, for example, in wrestling with the hopelessness dialectic, let's say one of the sources of hopelessness for somebody is recognizing that the climate is unlikely to get better in their lifetime. In fact, it's likely to get worse. Well, let's say then in exploring sources of hope, they've got narratives and religious beliefs that are useful to them. They're able to think about the Hebrews' time in the desert as a journey that does take generations. So they've got a way to hold it that feels meaningful. Or say they get involved in activities with other people that are working on things they're feeling hopeless about, like protecting the pollinators. Then they can find meaning in the agency and the solidarity. That the anxiety doesn't go away, as I said, because the anxiety is realistic. But then it exists alongside sources of meaning, and that buffers it. That makes it much more bearable. Now, part of trouble we get into in our medical model is we tend to think in terms of cure, and that's not so applicable here, because new difficulties and sources of heartbreak are going to continually arise. So if our hypothetical patient is finding meaning in raising bees, that doesn't mean
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there's a cure here. Reasonable hope and radical hope and finding sources of meaning, these things have to be worked on in an ongoing way. The transformation of anxiety is an ongoing activity.
So transforming, ongoing. Yeah, what a powerful approach. And as you said before, it's really important to recognize that we're in this together. So
Yep.
I wanted to ask you something that also I think is very interesting. In your work, you talk about nonverbal experiences. You highlight the importance of integrating nonverbal experiences and wordless therapy. How do therapists effectively incorporate these elements in their practice?
Well, this is an important question. If someone isn't talking about something, that doesn't mean it's not important in their experience or a big problem that they're dealing with. It may just be that it's too hard to put words to. And
Mm.
it's important for us to keep that in mind. Wordlessness in response to climate change exists for a few reasons. It exists because of the extent of the complexity and threat, as I've talked about. That makes it hard to think about. There was a study by cognitive psychologists that analyzed interviews of farmers who were well informed about climate change. And in these interviews, it was demonstrated that what they call cognitive isolation, very much akin to the disavowal I was talking about, where the climate information is in there, but it's not really integrated into thinking about what they deal with every day. So that's one reason for the wordlessness. The extent of the complexity and threat has this information just not integrated usefully. And then another cause of the wordlessness can be that it can be socially awkward to talk about climate change. The patient, consciously or unconsciously, may think it's not an appropriate topic to bring up. They don't want to burden the therapist with something heavy that they think the therapist can't fix anyway. And also, they may not want to risk being disappointed by the response of the therapist, since actually this is so important. So just as the information doesn't get integrated well cognitively, oftentimes, it can also not get integrated well in relationships, not even in the therapeutic relationship. And then another reason for the wordlessness is that because the extent of the threat is such that it evokes developmentally very early fears that are themselves pre-verbal.
Mhm.
The infant, if we think about it, is wholly dependent on the caregiver and dependent on being able to be attached to the caregiver well enough. And it's a similar situation we're in with climate change. I mean, even though we may avoid thinking about it, we're completely dependent on a sufficiently stable climate and on the other parts of our biosphere. All of that being threatened brings up these very early pre-verbal fears we don't even have words for. Now, there's also a positive aspect of wordlessness that I think is important to mention. Experiences of awe, a spiritual experience, that's affirming of the ineffable but magnificent situation we're in, being alive, being connected to everything else, that this is a source of meaning. And this spiritual sense and understanding, this all we get in our relationship with the rest of the natural world, it's a very useful and important counterbalance to the fears. And it's one of the ways to be contained enough to move forward with agency. So wordlessness is not just reflecting something problematic. It can also reflect what's so important here. So in working with any situation where the patient seems to be having thoughts or feelings but isn't putting them into words, the possibility of an experience being wordless can still be validated by the therapist. I mean, saying something like, perhaps because it can feel so big, it can be hard to put words to it, or it may feel as though there aren't words for it. Then the therapist isn't stymied by the wordlessness. The wordlessness is something that can still be talked about. There can still be a shared understanding, even of wordlessness.
Yeah, no, I get it now. And putting our feelings to words and talking about it, talking to our therapist, even though we think it might be too much. And I love the spiritual part of it, like finding a bigger meaning in all of this, to take action and do something about it. That's really powerful. Yeah, and I want to ask you, if we look ahead, what do you see as the most important areas for future research and practice in climate-aware therapy?
Well, so we do have some research, but we do need more specific research on what's helpful under different circumstances and for whom. We also need research on the lay-led group interventions that are out there, like the Good Grief Network, the Work That Reconnects workshops. I mean, there are various things out there that look to be built on sound psychological understandings, but they haven't been specifically researched as to what aspects of them are helpful and for what and for whom. And in terms of what we ought to be focusing on in mental health practice, there are two glaring needs in terms of psychotherapy related to climate change. The first is a need for mental health professionals to have environments where they can grapple with their own feelings about climate change in order to really be available for patients in this. It's not enough just to have information. We have to really do our own ongoing emotional work. And there are some resources for this. There are climate cafes that are informal support groups to talk about your feelings about climate change. There are climate-aware therapy trainings being done. And one of those training programs is a joint project of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance North America. All kinds of therapists can take those trainings. And people can also just find a climate buddy where both of you agree you're going to be processing your feelings about climate together. But there really is this need for mental health professionals. And then a second glaring need is greater emphasis on group and community interventions. We're going to need population level management of stress and population level promotion of resilience and occupation of individual and collective agency and creativity, and all of this while understanding the stress that we're under with the social crisis and hopefully the big transition we're in. And we also are expecting and are seeing regressions in behavior, like the social polarization that we have and all the varieties of denial. And so this is a large-scale population-wide problem. And with all of this, and with what we're anticipating in the future, with climate stress and disruption and tragedies that are coming down the pike, there's no way that we're going to be able to address this effectively, the mental health need, with our one-on-one treatment in our offices. Like, group and community interventions and the funding for those are really a need for urgent attention. And then within our profession, the most important ways for our profession to prepare are to, again, work at holding two things at the same time and work at, in this case, using the things we already know, all the technologies we have, at the same time that we recognize that new things are now required of us. Individually and collectively, clinicians and patients alike are in need of a great deal of containment now as we work to consider the situation we're in and potential futures, and as we work to innovate. And so there's a need for us to continue to use the paradigms we already have while introducing an overarching one that involves these new things being required of us in short order. And then I know we've already used a lot of time. So just lastly, I want to say, the chair of the APA Climate Committee, Josh Wartzel, often says psychiatry is really in kind of a sweet spot in our abilities to contribute now. And I think he's right. Because of our scientific background and medical training, we understand the science. And then we also can get and address the psychological issues. We have understandings about mental health effects of tremendous stress and how to address them. So I think that we're in a position to really help.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here in the podcast today. It really means a lot to me, and I think that our audience is going to enjoy a lot of this conversation. Thank you for your time, Dr. Lewis.
Sure, I've enjoyed it.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance Podcast. If you like this episode and would like to support this podcast and the work of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, please go to climatepsychiatry.org to join or donate today. Let's work together to create a healthier planet and a healthier mind. Until next time, take care.